Hello everyone and welcome to Spirit Basics. I'm Jennifer Allan. Now this is the show for both a beginner and the avid connoisseur of fine spirits.
I'm Stephen Olson. Today's show is going to be all about brandy. And the very word brandy comes from a Dutch word for burnt wine. Brandwijn, they called it. This is from an ancient process where, because wine doesn't travel very well on ships for long voyages, they used to actually boil the wine down, and then when they arrived at their port of call, they'd add a little water back to it.
Now isn't brandy distilled?
Well, yes, brandy today is distilled. This concept of burnt wine was ancient, but what they learned later from the Moors, when the Moors brought their distillation to the rest of Europe from southern Spain, we've talked about this before, they took this burnt wine and cooked it and recaptured the alcohol on the other side. That would be the difference in distillation. Now, brandy, by definition, is made from either grapes or fruit. Generally speaking, these alembic stills a double pot distillation, and not only is it made all over Europe, but now it's made all over the world.
So if it's made all over the world, does that mean, like vodka, there are no rules that govern its production?
Well, actually, there are some brandies, of course, that have no rules, but for the most part, most of the categories of brandy have very specific laws, and there are very specific types of brandy.
Okay, so if brandy's made all over the world, how did this idea of distilling grapes and fruit make its way all the way around the world?
It's a great question. If you remember, sometimes we've talked about the merchants of the sea, the Dutch and the English, because they keep cropping up in our spirits history, and they were the ones who were carrying barrels in the cargo hold of their ships for trade all over. And as they went from place to place, to the Far East, to the New World, they would trade alcohol. Well, they created a need for alcohol in these places, and eventually distillation spread to those areas as well. Now, we know from our experience with the Moors, for example, and many other places, that they chose to make brandies and so forth out of fruit because it ferments naturally, not like grain where we have to brew it and then ferment it. But even more than the ease of fermentation and distillation, these spirits, whether they're whiskey, brandy, vodka, they're determined more by the climatic conditions. If grapes will grow there, if fruit grow there naturally, we make brandy. If not, generally speaking, because grain grows, we'll make whiskey or vodka.
Well, now for his own look at the history behind brandy, we turn to our master mixologist, Dale Degroff.
Brandy is a big, wonderful subject. Brandy is made all around the world from a lot of different sources. We know that grape brandy is probably the biggest variety, but as Steve and Jennifer so aptly pointed out, brandy is also made from stone fruits. Brandy is made from pears, apples. There's a very famous brandy in the lower 48 from New Jersey, Laird's Applejack, or also affectionately known as Jersey Lightning, that was the basis of a great cocktail called the Jack Rose. Lemon juice, applejack brandy, grenadine, a little sugar. As a matter of fact, Laird's Applejack was one of the very first distilled spirits in America. William Laird started distilling it in 1658, and the Laird family, 10 generations later, is still making Laird's Applejack. Brandy was in New Orleans at the beginning of the cocktail tradition there. Brandy was a big, important part of the spirits industry in the 19th century in the lower 48. California made lots and lots of brandy in the 19th century. It wasn't considered to be on the par with the great alembic brandies that came from Europe, but it was nonetheless a brandy. And brandy in California is a growing subject, which we will touch on in the next episode. Those early apple brandies, before we even had distilling apparatus, in colonial New England were made by putting hard cider out in the first freeze. And each morning they'd go out and skim the ice off that hard cider day after day until a lot of the water had been evaporated off, and what was left was a much higher alcohol apple kind of brandy. So they made brandy without even having distilling apparatus. Brandy was always been there for the cocktail. As a matter of fact, the very first 3 big categories in 1862 in Jerry Thomas's book of cocktail were brandy cocktails, whiskey cocktails, and gin cocktails. Even before the cocktail was a category, brandy was there for the birth of the julep. The mint julep, which we affectionately know as a bourbon and mint drink, was not in the beginning in the 18th century, because in the 18th century, bourbon didn't even exist as a category, and juleps were made from brandy and from peach brandy. Brandy was huge in the history of Canada. There was the famous Brandy Parliament of the 17th century, when the Catholic Church tried to dictate to the state that they could not sell brandy to the native population, and the Brandy Parliament reversed that decision, and setting a precedent for the dealings between the state and the church very early on in Canada. Brandy is a part of the cocktail that I want to discuss in more detail in the next episode, when we talk about the king of brandies, the star of the show, and that would be cognac. So we'll get to that next time, but in the meantime, I'm going to have a Hemingway brandy and soda.
Up next, we'll talk about how brandy is made.
And our Spirit Insiders, Morgen and Scott, step out to see what they can discover about brandy. That's when Spirit Basics returns. Welcome back to Spirit Basics. Right now, let's talk about how brandy is made.
Let's break brandy down into three basic categories to make it a little bit easier. For the most part, let's say that there are grape or fruit-based brandies that spend at least some time in an oak barrel for aging, all right? And this could be grapes, but it could also be apples, apricots, cherries, plums, pears, raspberries, basically anything that grows in the ground, even blueberries. Now, there's the second category, which would be un-oak-aged fruit brandies, and that's what we call eau de vie, or the French call them that anyway.
Water of life.
That's exactly right. And then we would have the pomace brandies, which are grappas or mars, but we actually handled that in another episode, and as you probably learned then, those are the grapes that are left over from winemaking that today can be very, very elegant.
Okay, well, who makes what? Where are all these different types of brandies from?
Let's break it down. Basically, our grape-based brandies are made in all the wine-growing regions of the world, and in places like Cognac and in Armagnac, which, again, we're going to handle in another episode. Spanish brandies, great value from Jerez, Spain, where the Moors started in the first place. U.S., Canada, South Africa, Australia, Germany, great brandies from all over the world. Now, there's one in particular that I love that's called Pisco that we make cocktails out of, and Pisco comes from Chile or Peru, and it's a grape-based brandy that sees no oak aging. Then we have our oak-aged fruits, which would be Applejack or Calvados, which of course Dale's going to talk about later, and Slivovitz, which comes from Eastern Europe, which is made from plums or prunes. In the un-oak-aged styles, all of those fruits that I talked about, the eau de vie from Alsace, France, but actually from all over the country, from Switzerland, Germany, Austria, the U.S., they can really be made anywhere.
Well, for a deeper look at how brandy's made, we turn now to our spirit guide.
The word brandy comes from a Dutch word, brandwijn, which just means burnt wine. And basically that's what we have. And if brandy is burnt wine, then any place you make wine, you could make brandy. And indeed we do. Of course, you'll see Italian brandies, which tend to be sleeker and cleaner and softer, and Greek brandies, which tend to be, to me, a little bit fuller, but also a bit tart. Spanish brandies, which I love. They're fat and full and rich. American brandies, hard to put a simple descriptor on those because there's a real complex series of brandies being made from California all the way up to Washington. And some of them can stand alongside, frankly, I think the greatest in Cognac and the greatest in Armagnac. So to some degree I can determine the style, I can predict the style of the brandy knowing where it comes from. But probably the more important element would be knowing how long it was in barrel, having some sense of that, being able to ask a retailer and get that information. If it's been in barrel a long time, it's going to have those caramel, honey, butterscotch, dried fruit characters that you get from a long time in barrel. Does a long time in barrel equal great brandy? The answer to that would be no. It depends. There are some brandies that come from certain places like Cognac and Armagnac that can live a long time in a barrel and still retain their fruitiness. But a lot of places, if you leave a brandy in barrel for more than 5 or 10 or 15 years, the fruit disappears. And now to me, it's not a well-balanced brandy.
Well, now that we've had a brief look at the history, the origins, and the process of making brandy, time for an inside look.
And our Spirit Insiders, Morgen and Scott, went on a journey to learn more about brandy.
Thanks, Steve and Jennifer. I'm down here at Wine Fest to see if I can find anyone drinking a distilled wine called Brandy. So Ross, you come down to some of these events and you're trying different drinks. You know, why do you think that maybe someone would go to a booth and pick up some brandy to try?
Well, brandy's really nice to have at a wine tasting event because it's distilled wine. It's just wine that's been concentrated through the distilling process.
If you're a first-time drinker of cognac brandy, you're thinking you're still expecting maybe some of the same properties. What you don't understand is that, it's quite a bit stronger, significantly stronger. So it's a bit of a shock to the system at the first time.
How do you think some people would, pick out the differences between a brandy and a cognac, or is there any between them?
Oh, there certainly is. I think the main thing that we're going to notice is regional diversity. Cognac is coming from the Cognac region, just off of the west coast of France. And the brandies were coming from anywhere else. They're going to experiment with different grapes, different distillation processes, different soils, certainly.
The laws are different. They may be able to use more caramel to get the color and the smoothness. But the difference from an aged cognac to a brandy is not only in the price, it's also in the quality.
What do you think you should say to someone that has never tried brandy and is going to experience it for the first time? What do you like about it?
The things I like about it is the finesse and the complexity of it. So the thing to really watch is to take your time, smell the brandy. Don't just gulp it down. Take a few minutes, swirl it, sniff it out of your glass, and then when you sip it, savor it. Don't take a big gulp, take a small sip, and kind of notice how long the flavor lasts, what different flavors you get, because you get a real range of flavors and real nice complex qualities to it.
The original glass was not a wine glass. Wasn't a snifter, it was a stem glass, like a Swiss white wine glass, where you kept your hand around it and sniffed it like this, or drank it like this, like the temperature of your warm hand gives you the temperature of the product, in other words, you hold it like this. So let the alcohol dissipate after the swirling, and then get the flavor to it.
Well, Steve and Jennifer, there's lots of people down here that know about brandy, but we'll see next week if they know a lot about cognac. So back to you guys.
Remember that brandy comes in many different flavors and styles and is oftentimes aged in oak barrels, from used sherry barrels to French oak, sometimes up to 50 or 60 years even. And then, of course, we have some brandies that see no oak aging at all.
Well, thank you. Up next, we continue our look into the world of brandy, how to drink it, and how to use it in some of your favorite cocktails. Don't go away.
Spirit Basics is brought to you in part by Willow Park Wines and Spirits.
Welcome back to Spirit Basics, the show for everyone who wants to learn more about the world's great cocktails. Time now to take a closer look at how to enjoy brandy.
Now, I know a lot of people who enjoy their favorite spirit in a brandy snifter. Is this obviously the way to enjoy brandy?
Well, it's certainly a traditional way, and I just want to take a second to say, as we always say, there are no rules to enjoying your favorite spirits. You drink them how you like them. But the traditions are strong, and certainly the brandy snifter is an old tradition, and we drink so many different spirits out of it because it's just fun to hold. It's really a North American passion, along with the champagne flute and the martini glass. That's a magical glass. But if you were to visit Cognac, if you were to visit Jerez, you would more than likely be served brandy in a glass like this. And the only reason for that is that it tends to be less alcohol in the nose. This one kind of pushes the alcohol up a little bit, even though the aromatics are really gentle this way. But if you were to drink an un-oak aged brandy or an eau de vie, oftentimes we drink them chilled and before dinner as an aperitif. And of course, all of these brandies make great cocktails, whether it be the Brandy Alexander, the Sidecar, or the Pisco Sour.
Well, for more on how to enjoy brandy, we're joined by our spirit advisor.
Brandy is such a varied drink. There are so many kinds of brandies out there that it's going to be very difficult for us to simply say, well, this is brandy and this is how you do it, because we need to know what kind of brandy you're talking about. Are you talking about an eau de vie that is un-oak aged? in which case I wouldn't have it on the rocks in a glass like this. I would have it in a wine glass, or even in some sort of a grappa glass, the kind of glass that would allow me to really enjoy the aromas of it. Is it a brandy that comes from Spain that's so fat and rich that having it in a snifter is a pretty wonderful thing, because the flavors absolutely could fill up practically a bowl the size of this room? Or is it a pisco? Pisco is a muscat-based brandy made in Peru and Chile that, to me, has a very floral, but also a very evanescent aroma. So I need a relatively small glass to capture what is there, because it's a beautiful thing, it's a very floral thing, it's very pretty. And if I drop it in any sort of tumbler or any large snifter, I'm not going to capture any of the lovely aromas that are possibly there. Calvados, that fruit-based brandy, well, it's based on apples. I'm going to get flavors that are aptly, very rich apple, baked apple, cooked apple, but also green apple, and also green pear. Indeed, sometimes they throw a little pears in there on top of the apples to add a touch of tartness to the tail end of the Calvados. But I need a snifter that opens all that up. For my part, I'm having brandy and soda. It's a classic drink of the 19th century and a really nice way to show off the caramel notes of a very fine brandy.
Well, our master mixologist, King Cocktail, Dale Degroff, joins us now with a look at how to make a cocktail with brandy.
Well, brandies are a big subject, as we found out, around the world, and I have a couple of brandies from different countries here. I have a brandy called Marquis de Villard, which is it's actually not from Cognac, it's from another part of France, so we can't call it Cognac. It's a very good brandy, aged in oak, and alongside that, I have a brandy called Lepanto, which is a Spanish brandy, as you might guess from the name. They're both aged, but aged in different ways. This is aged in one barrel for a certain number of years. This brandy is aged by the Solera method, which means that they'll move this brandy from barrel to barrel with increasingly older brandies. The Spanish like to say the old brandy teaches the young brandy. And what I'm going to do is make a drink called the Barcelona, which was a drink I did for the Olympics when they were in Barcelona. And I wanted to use a lot of Spanish products, so I'm going to start with a little Spanish brandy, 3/4 of an ounce. And followed by, actually a little dash more, followed by another Spanish product, also aged by the Solera method, a dry sack sherry that, although the name sort of is misleading because Fino sherry, we found out, is actually quite a bit drier than dry sack sherry, which is a medium dry sherry, and not the sherry that you would have with food, but the sherry that you would have by itself at tea time or cocktail hour. We've got those two 3/4 of an ounce each. I'm going to bring into the fray a little bit of orange juice, also 3/4 of an ounce, maybe an ounce. I'm going to bring into the recipe some cream. And then finally, I'm going to finish with a little bit of simple syrup. This is going to be shaken very hard to avoid the kind of chemical reaction that likes to go on between citrus and cream. So here we go. This is not finished yet because I have a couple of finishing touches at the end of the drink, which I'll add just before I serve it. And obviously it's a kind of an after-dinner drink. I'd serve it in a little sherry style, actually a port style glass. A sherry style glass would be a little bit smaller than that. Smells very woody and Spanish. And kind of an adult orange Julius feeling to it. Put a couple cubes in here. Keep it nicely chilled. I'm not going to fill it with ice because I don't want that. You could also do this as a frozen drink in the blender. Now I'm going to take a little bit of Cointreau as a float. Hopefully it'll stay right on top because it's a little bit. The heavy will maybe stay on top because it's a sweet drink. And then just a touch of cinnamon, because cinnamon and orange is one of those matches made in heaven. The Barcelona. Salud. Back to you, Jennifer, Steve.
I find that cocktails with Spanish brandies and sherry can be amazing.
They look really yummy.
I'm ready for one.
After the break, we head into the kitchen to see what we can make with brandy. That's when Spirit Basics returns. Welcome back to Spirit Basics. We're in the kitchen and we're joined by our spirit chef, Chef Allan. Thanks again for joining us.
Oh, it's great to be back, Jennifer.
Now, today we're talking about cooking with Brandy. When I think of Brandy, I think of, all things elegant. And we have some examples here of some dishes that were made with Brandy, but they look a little on the casual side, almost like appetizers.
Well, they are, but there's nothing wrong with a little elegance in appetizers. In fact, one of the nice things about cooking with Brandy is it is just that notch above some of the other spirits we've cooked with. It's got a more refined flavor, a smoother flavor, and so it's actually perfect for things like appetizers, because you want to actually get the taste of the brandy as opposed to maybe adding it to a sauce or something else.
So tell us about the dishes that we have in front of us. What are they?
Well, the dish closest to us here is a real classic, and it's steak tartare. So in addition to some really beautiful finely chopped beef tenderloin, we've got some Worcester sauce, some powdered mustard, and I've added a shot of brandy to it. And you can taste it in there, and it enhances all those other flavors, a little bit of the heat of the mustard and the salt of the Worcester sauce. And this is something that you would have found served on the Titanic. So talk about elegant. This is it.
It looks pretty fancy. Now over here, it looks like we have some kind of cheese dip.
Right, and we've used just a combination of cheeses, some Gouda and then some cream cheese as a base. And what I really want to accentuate here is the flavor of the brandy in this. And when you add it to it and you bake it or heat it up a little bit, the brandy comes to the fore, and it's just perfect with some plain flatbread. And again, when you're using something this elegant, sometimes what you don't want to do is mask the flavor. You actually want to feel it on the front of your tongue and you say, this is really good.
So would you typically add the brandy towards the end of the cooking process?
Well, it depends on what you're doing. In these cases, I wanted to use the brandy, but sometimes when you're saucing something and using a peppercorn sauce or a cream sauce, and you throw some brandy in, you do it at the very end because, again, this show is all about flavor, and that's the flavor that you're going to get when the sauce is warm. It's the same as when you're finishing a soup with brandy. You don't want to put it in too early. You want to put it at the end. But that doesn't mean that you can't start with brandy, like deglazing a pan, because the flavor is going to be there at the end.
So really, there's no rules.
There's no rules when it comes to using spirits, except that flavor is everything.
Now tell us quickly some of the other kinds of classic dishes that you would typically use brandy with.
Well, like I said, I mentioned some of them. A green peppercorn sauce finished with brandy, something like a pâté. Really, again, we're talking elegant, and that's what's nice about using brandy.
Great. Well, try these dishes out at home, and all you have to do is log on to our website for the recipes. Over to you now, Stephen.
Thanks, Jennifer. With all the different styles of brandy in the world, there are myriad ways that we can cook with it. That's it for this edition of Spirit Basics. We've taken a look at the brandies of the world. In our next 2 episodes, we'll take a closer look at Cognac and Armagnac, the great brandies of France. I'm Stephen Olson, and for Jennifer Allan and our entire team here at Spirit Basics, we'll see you next week. Santé.
Special thanks to Willow Park Wine and Spirits, whose dedication to providing knowledge, awareness, and service to their customers has made this show possible.